Welcome to the debate. Um, Imagine you have just an absolutely terrible day.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right, exactly. You lose your temper, you get defensive with a colleague, you completely retreat from your family, and you go to bed feeling just completely defeated.
Yeah, like a total failure.
Exactly. Traditional self-improvement frameworks would look at that day and call it a failure. But what if the simple act of realizing you lost your temper, say, 3 seconds faster than you did a year ago, is actually the ultimate proof of human growth?
Wow, yeah. 3 seconds.
Right. What if growth isn't about these perfectly peaceful days, but about a slightly different response to the exact same frustrating situation?
It's a complete paradigm shift because we are so conditioned to want the before and after photos of our inner lives.
Mm-hmm.
We want clear milestones. But when you look at the actual reality of human transformation, the terrain isn't a straight line. It's full of switchbacks, dead ends, and, walking in circles, basically.
Which is why the material we are examining today is so fascinating to me. So the Evidence of Growth Mood Journal is this framework that essentially just throws out that traditional linear map.
Completely throws it out.
Yeah. It is a highly structured system that blends really deep, rigorous emotional introspection with Christian spiritual practices. So it redefines what progress actually looks like.
Right.
But looking closely at this framework brings us to a massive central question. Does the true efficacy of this journal lie in its underlying psychological mechanisms, like its demand for emotional self-awareness, cognitive tracking, behavioral adjustment? Or is it fundamentally driven by something entirely different, like spiritual surrender, theological realignment, and an active dependence on the divine?
And that is the exact friction point we really need to unpack today.
To start us off, I will just lay out my position on this. When I analyze the architecture of the Evidence of Growth Mood Journal, I see a foundation that is deeply, brilliantly, and unmistakably psychological.
Okay,
The framework operates primarily through emotional tracking, identifying environmental triggers, and cultivating a really high level of cognitive awareness. The core message of the source material is, and I quote, "Your emotions are information, your patterns are information." That is an inherently empirical, psychological approach.
you're saying it treats it like data.
Yes, exactly. You are treating your inner life as data. The journal repeatedly anchors the user in 4 signature questions. So first, what am I feeling?
Which is basic awareness,
Right. Second, what is happening beneath the feeling?
cognitive understanding.
Exactly. Third, how am I responding? That's behavioral reflection. And finally, what evidence of growth can I find? Which is positive recognition.
Sure.
So even when spiritual terminology is layered on top of these prompts, the actual methodology that is doing the heavy lifting here is about recognizing behavioral triggers and consciously modifying your responses.
You think it's basically CBT?
It is. For all intents and purposes, cognitive behavioral therapy mapped onto a spiritual aesthetic. You are rewiring your brain through self-examination.
Well, I understand why you see those mechanics, but my position is that the psychological language it's merely the entry point. It is the vestibule, not the house itself.
Okay, the vestibule.
Yeah. If you only look at the emotional tracking, you are missing the overarching purpose of the journal, which the text explicitly identifies as, quote, greater dependence on God.
Right.
The material defines spiritual growth as far more than appearing strong or tracking data or mastering your emotional reactivity like you mentioned. It frames growth as character development orchestrated by an active, external divine agent. The text literally asks, what part of my character is God developing right now? So this framework isn't about self-reliance or, psychological self-help where you pull yourself up by your own cognitive bootstraps.
Right.
It is fundamentally about recognizing human limitations, surrendering control, and creating a memorial of faith based entirely on what God has already done. The engine driving the actual transformation isn't cognitive awareness. The engine is grace.
Well, let's look at how the text approaches the tension between healing and avoiding, because I think this is really important.
Okay?
The material makes a very sharp, very astute observation. It says not every positive thought is healing. It explicitly warns against using spirituality to avoid uncomfortable emotions.
Yes, it does.
Right. And if you are listening to this and you've ever used a blessed hashtag to cover up the fact that you're actually furious at your spouse or terrified about your finances, you know you have engaged in what psychologists call spiritual bypassing.
Oh, yeah. Spiritual bypassing is huge.
It's using faith as a shield to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological wounds.
Yes. And the journal actively guards against that exact tendency.
Right, but how does it guard against it? By demanding rigorous, uncompromising emotional honesty first.
Mm-hmm.
The text requires the user to look in the mirror and say, "This hurt," or "I'm angry," or "I'm afraid," or "I don't understand." You cannot progress in this journal without that raw psychological excavation.
That's true.
And there is a really profound biological reason why this works. When you force yourself to find the exact word for your pain, what psychologists call affect labeling.
Affect labeling.
Right. Yeah, affect labeling. You are literally forcing blood flow away from the amygdala, which is your brain's panic center, and pushing it up into the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical reasoning center.
Oh, wow. So it's physiological.
Completely physiological. You are using a word to pump the brakes on a panic attack. If you don't do that first, the spirituality is just an anesthetic. The journal's efficacy comes from forcing the user to stop avoiding their own mind, and that is a strictly psychological mechanism.
Well, I come at it from a different way. You are absolutely right that emotional honesty is a non-negotiable prerequisite in this framework. And your explanation of the neurology is spot on. I love the blood flow analogy.
Thanks. Yeah.
But you are stopping halfway through the journal's process. The text explicitly states that the purpose of acknowledging these feelings, the anger, the disappointment, the fear, it's not just to process them in a vacuum.
Okay.
The purpose is to, quote, bring those feelings honestly before God.
But isn't the processing itself the mechanism of healing? Like, I mean, if the amygdala calms down, you feel better, right?
Not according to the philosophy of this framework. Psychological processing without spiritual surrender often leaves people stuck in an endless loop of self-analysis.
Oh, interesting.
We see this all the time. You can know exactly why you are angry. You can trace it back to a childhood wound. You can track the trigger perfectly. You can understand the neuroscience of your own panic like you just laid out.
Right, right.
And you can still be entirely paralyzed by it. The text defines healing not just as understanding the emotion, but bringing that named pain to an omnipotent God to actually move forward.
I see.
Healing in this text happens in the relational exchange between the human and the divine. By bringing the emotion to God, the user is fundamentally shifting the burden of resolution off their own shoulders. That is a theological mechanism, not just blood flow in the brain.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective by looking at how the journal actually measures this forward movement you're talking about.
Okay, sure.
So in the section titled Stop Looking for Perfection, the material measures success through what I would call microcognitive shifts.
Microcognitive shifts. I like that phrase.
Yeah. It asks the user to look for evidence like, I noticed it sooner, or I recognized the thought. I didn't react immediately, or I gave myself grace.
Right. Small changes that accumulate into massive character shifts over time.
Exactly. But let's look at the actual mechanics of those shifts. These are internal, self-directed changes in emotional reactivity. When the journal asks, what emotional pattern keeps showing up? It is requiring the user to dissect their own mind. It asks, what belief might be connected to the pattern? This is pure cognitive restructuring.
You think it's all internal?
Yes, you are identifying a maladaptive belief, you are pausing the automatic response, and you are choosing a new behavior. You aren't just, praying the pattern away. You are doing the grueling, sweaty psychological work of rewiring your neural pathways.
Right, right.
Think of your brain like a snowy hill.
Okay, snowy hill.
Yeah, so the sled naturally wants to go down the deepest groove, right? Because it's the path of least resistance.
Sure.
The journal is basically asking you to drag the sled to fresh snow. The evidence of growth it celebrates, like I walked away or I communicated instead of shutting down, these are hard-won behavioral modifications.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are isolating these micro shifts from the broader structural rhythms that the journal demands.
How so?
Well, you were treating them as purely cognitive, self-directed efforts, but look at the architecture of the practices the material prescribes to achieve them. It introduces the Sunday evening spiritual reset
Oh, right, yeah.
and the 30-minute Christian journaling session.
Which, let's be honest, for most of us usually devolves into like a 5-minute scribble before the dog needs to go out or the kid starts screaming.
Very true, very true.
But the structural steps are very clear. It's arrive, observe, reflect.
Exactly. Life interrupts, but the structure remains. And look at where those steps culminate. They culminate in recognize, where God's grace was present, release and surrender to God, and reorient.
Okay.
Even more telling is the section on becoming the woman you're praying to become. The framework teaches the user to build habits that integrate faith into the daily friction of life. You know, waking up to scripture, praying during a walk, pausing to pray after a stressful moment.
Right.
These aren't just cognitive exercises, they are liturgies. And by liturgy, I mean they are habits specifically designed to shape what you love and what you desire, not just what you think.
That's a strong distinction.
Yeah. The evidence of growth isn't merely the cognitive victory of noticing a trigger. It is the habitual posture of turning to God in the midst of the trigger. The behavioral modification is a byproduct of the spiritual realignment, not the other way around.
See, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you can completely remove the spiritual vocabulary from those habits and the psychological and physiological benefits remain entirely intact.
You think so?
I do. Think about it. Waking up and reading a grounding text, whether it's Christian scripture or Marcus Aurelius or Mary Oliver poetry,
Right.
it sets a baseline of cognitive focus for the day. Taking a walk and engaging in silent reflection, whether you call it prayer or just secular mindfulness, it lowers your cortisol levels, it drops your heart rate, and it engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your body's rest and digest mode.
Sure, the biology is the same.
Exactly. The journal is leveraging proven biological mechanisms. So why does the theological vocabulary matter if the physiological result is identical?
It matters because the object of the reflection changes the entire nature of the exercise.
The object?
Yes. If I am practicing secular mindfulness, the object of my focus is my own breath, or my present state, or perhaps my own resilience.
Okay.
The focus is internal. If I am praying, the object is a sovereign, loving creator. The focus is external.
I see.
The psychological mechanism might look exactly the same on an fMRI machine. You know, the heart rate drops, the breathing slows. But the existential reality is entirely different. The journal specifically asks, what has God already done that I never want to forget?
Right, that's one of the prompts.
It explicitly directs the user to create a memorial of faith. This isn't just about calming the nervous system so you can get through Tuesday. It is about anchoring your identity in a historical narrative of divine faithfulness. That shifts your entire worldview, not just your cortisol levels.
That is really interesting. Let's test that idea by looking at what happens when the journaling and the mindfulness don't seem to be working.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's say you were doing everything right, but your external circumstances are still just a complete disaster.
Which happens to all of us.
Right. That is where the journal introduces one of its most fascinating concepts, the framework of the hidden season.
Ah, yes, the hidden season.
The text talks about when God is growing you in private. It directly addresses those agonizing periods where circumstances aren't changing, where there is zero external evidence of success, and life is just a complete mess.
It uses the phrase, roots grow underground before fruit appears above the surface.
Precisely. Now, functionally, this is a highly sophisticated psychological tool designed to build resilience by shifting a person's locus of control.
Explain what you mean by locus of control.
Sure. So, locus of control is a psychological concept that is essentially like driving a car. Despair happens when you turn the steering wheel and the car doesn't respond.
Right.
The tires don't move. Your external circumstances are completely out of your control. What this journal brilliantly does in the Hidden Season chapter is tell the driver, stop looking at the road and focus on upgrading the engine.
Ooh, I like that metaphor.
Thanks. It shifts the user from an external locus of control, where they are victims of circumstance, to an internal locus of control, by saying, I am developing patience, I am developing emotional maturity. It prevents total psychological collapse. It allows the user to look at a stagnant, painful life and say, I am still growing. It frames adversity as a classroom. It gives them their steering wheel back, just internally. It is a brilliant coping mechanism.
That is a very compelling argument, but have you considered that reducing this to just a coping mechanism strips the concept of its actual power?
How so?
Well, a psychological reframing relies entirely on my ability to convince myself that my suffering has a purpose.
Right.
I have to manufacture the meaning, but the material does not say, you are growing yourself in private. It says, when God is growing you in private. It asks, what might God be developing in me privately before I see the results publicly? This is a profoundly theological stance.
But functionally, the result is the same. The individual finds a way to persevere through the pain.
Functionally in the short term, perhaps, but conceptually and sustainably, they are worlds apart. The theological framework of the hidden season requires genuine belief in a sovereign God who is actively, purposefully shaping one's character for a future calling.
Right.
It elevates the journal from a subjective mood tracker into an active, objective dialogue with the divine. It's not just me telling myself a story to survive a bad year. It is me trusting that a master architect is laying a foundation I cannot yet see.
That's powerful.
If it's just the psychological trick, it falls apart the moment I'm too exhausted to maintain the illusion. True trust, that faith that someone else is holding the blueprint, that is what actually sustains the person, not just a mental shift in their locus of control.
I hear you on the blueprint, but look at the actual questions the journal asks the user to answer to find that evidence of growth.
Okay.
It asks, what used to trigger me that doesn't affect me as much anymore? What emotional pattern have I become more aware of? What boundary have I learned to establish?
Yes, it does ask those.
The material is rigorously empirical about the self. It treats your emotional responses as data points. The signature message of the journal is literally your emotions are information, your patterns are information, your responses are information. It is teaching people to become scientists of their own inner lives. That empirical detachment, the ability to step back in the heat of an argument and say, oh, look at that, my heart rate just spiked. I desperately want to lash out, but instead I recognize the thought and I am walking away.
Right.
That is the absolute triumph of psychological awareness. It moves the user from being a victim of their emotions to an investigator of them.
It is a triumph, absolutely. Becoming an investigator of your own mind is a massive step forward. But let's look at the totality of that signature message.
Okay.
It says all those things are information, yes. But what do those pieces of information create? The text says they create evidence that you are not the same person you used to be.
Right.
And in the context of this specific journal, that transformation is not achieved merely by being a good scientist of your own mind. It is achieved by the grace of God, operating through those very moments of friction.
So the data is secondary.
The data collected is emotional, sure. But the entire architecture of the journal exists to point the user toward spiritual reliance. It turns everyday frustrations, an argument with a spouse, a delayed career plan, a sudden moment of anxiety. It turns them into opportunities to witness God's transformative grace in real time.
So if I am understanding your perspective correctly, you're saying the psychological tools, the affect labeling, the cognitive restructuring, the tracking,
Yes,
they are essentially just the instruments used to measure a spiritual phenomenon.
precisely. The thermometer is not the heat.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, the cognitive awareness is simply the instrument that allows you to read the temperature of the spiritual transformation God is enacting in your character. You need the thermometer to know what's happening, but the thermometer isn't what's warming the house.
That is a really fascinating way to delineate the two. I think where we ultimately converge here is on the sheer brilliance of how this material completely dismantles the myth of perfectionism.
Oh, without a doubt. That is arguably one of its strongest and most necessary contributions to anyone trying to grow.
Right. Whether you view it through the lens of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we know that demanding perfection inevitably leads to shame spirals, which then leads to behavioral regression,
Right.
or you view it through a theological lens, the result is incredibly freeing. The journal proves that deep, meaningful growth almost never happens on the mountaintop.
No, it really does.
It occurs in the quiet, radically imperfect moments of simply choosing a slightly different response to a very old trigger. It redefines victory.
Yes.
Victory isn't never feeling anxious again. Victory is feeling the anxiety, naming it, and choosing not to let it dictate your next action.
Yes, it profoundly normalizes the struggle. It reminds the reader that, as the text says, falling back into an old pattern doesn't mean you are back at the beginning.
That's such a great quote.
It is that one sentence removes the crushing weight of both religious legalism and psychological self-judgment. It replaces the demand for perfection with a demand for presence. Presence with your own messy emotions and presence with God in the middle of them.
The structural brilliance of the Evidence of Growth Mood Journal really is its insistence on treating our struggles as information rather than indictments.
Well said.
It utilizes profound psychological awareness to map the reality of personal change, proving to the user that just because you had a terrible day, it does not mean you haven't grown.
And it masterfully ensures that this growth isn't a lonely, exhausting, self-reliant endeavor.
Right.
It turns the raw data of our daily lives into an ongoing conversation with the divine, ensuring that our hardest, most hidden seasons are recognized as the very soil where God is cultivating our deepest character.
It really seems integrating psychological honesty with spiritual practice offers a uniquely rigorous path to transformation.
Absolutely.
There is so much more to explore in this material, particularly regarding how these daily micro-reflections compound over the course of a year, but we'll have to leave it there for today.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
We did. We leave it to you, the listener, to decide whether your own growth is best measured by the precision of psychological self-awareness, the depth of your spiritual surrender, or the messy, beautiful intersection of both.
It is certainly a journey worth tracking, whichever lens you look through.
Because at the end of the day, human growth isn't a clean, straight line on a map. It's a rugged, unpredictable terrain. And this journal gives you the tools to stop looking for a perfect destination and finally learn how to read the landscape you're actually standing in. We'll see you next time.